Okay. There we go. Okay. Can everyone see that okay? I'm going to try to minimize all of you as much as I love seeing your faces. So thank you again for welcoming me. Hi. You can see okay. Okay. So this evening I will be talking about elephants, but I am an anthropologist and a conservationist and a photographer. So I'll be talking about elephants from a perspective of how they relate to and interact with people, and rather than theoretical. And I intend to show lots of photos. So my big passion is in understanding the connections between people and wildlife. Of course, but rather it's a tapir from my long-term study site in Peru. So what influences people to love certain species or feel motivated to care about and protect them? What influences people to feel indifference, antipathy, or fear? For the record, I love elephants and I fear them too, and maybe you'll understand more why as we go through the conversation this evening. But as a social scientist, my work in conservation is about learning and documenting how things like cultural beliefs, policies, and incentives shape our values about animals and how we interact with animals. How can we understand the complicated relationships we have with wildlife? So I could talk for hours about the complicated relationships between people and elephants, but I'm going to limit myself to 40 minutes this evening, so hopefully we can have lots of time for questions and discussion. And here are the 4 things that I'll focus on. The concept of human-elephant conflict, or HEC, what it is and what it means for elephants and people. I want to take you to the Okavango Panhandle of Botswana, a place where there are more elephants than people, in a country that has more elephants than anywhere in the world. I want to share with you some of the things we've been doing as a nonprofit organization in Botswana called Ecoexist. And lastly, I want to talk about the implications. Why should we care about human-elephant conflict? So I want to say that if you can imagine me behind my face here, a whole beautiful group of people, I'm here representing as many of them as I can, including the 2 directors of Ecoexist in Botswana, Dr. Anna Songhurst and Dr. Graham McCulloch, and also our field coordinators, Matata Koshongo, who actually now is a chief in his village, Mojito Mosupi there, and Makata Baitseng, and also the Ecoexist community officers. Those are all the beautiful faces you're seeing in this slide. And they represent each of the 15 villages we work with in Botswana. I'm also hoping to try and represent lots of residents of the Okavango, and then also the elephants too. So whether or not you've ever seen an elephant in the wild, and I hope many of you have, it's possible, maybe even likely, that elephants have some kind of significance for you. Of course, we've grown up with them in our storybooks and movies, our animal crackers and cupcakes. I certainly hope that you can see this one. On the one hand, elephants...
Yeah, we're not seeing pictures, we're seeing you.
Oh, oh no.
I'm seeing her.
Excuse me.
I'm seeing her quite clearly. I'm only seeing her. And I'm only seeing pictures. I'm not seeing her.
Oh no.
Slideshow's working fine.
All right,
It's fine.
hi, hello. Thank you so much for your
Now I got
input.
'em.
Please mute yourselves, and as a matter of fact, I will. Amanda, please unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yes, we see both. If you have a problem like that again, I please request that you use the chat to let us know so that we don't need to interrupt the speaker. Thank you so much for your understanding.
Okay. Well, I paused on the slide of Snuffleupagus and just hoping that you could see him as well. Thinking about how elephants are part of our cultural story. We've grown up with them. So on the one hand, elephants are unlike any other creature on earth. Richard Leakey once called them whales of the land. On the other hand, the more we learn about elephants, the more we see how much they are like us in their intelligence, capacity for self-awareness, their memory, family, and social life. So like people, they're long-lived and big-brained, and they have a relatively slow developmental period. Just as humans take a couple of decades to become grown-ups, maybe a little longer for some of us, elephants take almost as long to learn how to be a grown-up elephant. Of course, elephants carry a lot of weight ecologically. They are the civil engineers of the animal kingdom, transforming forests to grasslands as they move through landscapes, taking down trees and vegetation. With their powerful trunks and tusks, they dig holes that become wells and water points for other species. And of course, economically, they are of tremendous value as well for the tourism and safari industries in the world. So much of the media attention on elephants in recent years is on the ivory trade and the sharp declines in the population. There's tremendous alarm over the plight of elephants, and that's for good reason. By one estimate, we've lost 100,000 elephants in 3 years. The word extinction has been used. This is an elephant I photographed 2 years ago in a remote part of Botswana, and the part of Botswana I'll be talking about, but you can see he was killed for his ivory, and you can see that, sorry to share this with you, that his face was hacked. This is his trunk. But there's another story to be told about elephants, especially in Southern Africa, where populations are thriving. And that's a story of conflict with people. A healthy elephant population needs lots of room to roam. And there is no park or reserve really anywhere in the world that has enough habitat suitable for large numbers. So we've seen in places like Sri Lanka with Asian elephants where they've been translocated to parks, but then they either break out and cause problems for people or themselves, or they starve on the insufficient resources of a confined area. So the elephant range overlaps with human settlements. Some have said elephants must live among us or not at all. So it's in these spaces of competition over resources, places that have been called elephant landscapes, that we find human-elephant conflict. In this next slide, this is actually a composite of 3 images that 3 moments that I photographed in a span of just about 30 minutes. In northern Botswana, this is the same stretch of road. First, you see the elephants crossing. You can barely see in the middle, those are people crossing, and then dogs right after them. There was actually a 4th group, a group of cows that crossed in the same area, and for some reason I didn't photograph them. But this is shared space. This is an elephant-human social ecological landscape. So if you're a human in places like this, when we talk about conflict, what does that mean? Conflict comes in the form of elephants trampling your crops or eating your crops. Sometimes we call this crop raiding. Sometimes wiping out an entire year's supply of food in just one night. It comes in the form of elephants destroying your property or fences, sometimes endangering you or your family. So, elephants are not predators, but they can be very dangerous, especially if they're startled or feel threatened. They can charge. So for most people who live close to elephants, these animals don't conjure Dumbo or Horton or Snuffleupagus. They conjure fear, danger, and insecurity. So if you're an elephant in this place, conflict comes in the form of people destroying your habitat, or perhaps blocking your access to water. It comes in people harassing you or scaring you or killing you. In Botswana, if you're an elephant and you've entered a person's farm, that person is legally allowed to kill you. So if the illegal ivory trade, if we can think of that as like a meteorite that's hitting elephant populations and really endangering them. Human-elephant conflict is death by 1,000 cuts. Even if we get a handle on the ivory trade, and many seem to believe that we are doing that, human-elephant conflict, or HEC, remains a real threat that looms. And yet, we hear relatively little about it. It's rare that we hear stories from people who can tell us firsthand what human-elephant conflict feels like, who know what it's like to stand vigil beside a field of millet and maize in the middle of the night, just praying that an elephant won't come, and really having little more than a string of tin cans around your field to make noise to scare them in case one does. So HEC, it's not a new problem. It's been documented for centuries. Elephants are not the only animals that raid crops or eat crops. Raiding has a really negative connotation. I try to talk about eating rather than raiding. So forgive me if I do that. But elephants are not the only animals here that eat people's crops. People report problems with their own cows. There are problems with porcupines, birds, and monkeys. But the thing is, elephants are dangerous in ways that those other animals aren't. A single incident with an elephant can be deadly or catastrophic. So there's an extra fear with elephants, and there can be a tendency to exaggerate the problem. So in this way, conflict is both real and imagined. It's actual and perceived. An elephant eating your crops is a problem, yes, but the threat of an elephant eating your crops is also a problem. That constant threat means that you live with stress. So maybe we don't hear so much about HEC because it's not so black and white as the ivory trade. It's not so clear who or what is to blame or what the root of the problem is. HEC is a complex challenge. It's connected with the ivory trade, yes, but it's attached to poverty, social inequality, conflicting land use policies, misguided conservation efforts, the global politics of animal rights, the feeling that elephants belong to all of us, even if we all don't have to bear the burden of living with them. We often say human-elephant conflict is rooted in human-human conflict. Though so many of us have these connections with elephants, everyone I know loves elephants, we don't all agree with each other about the value of elephants or what to do with them. So like the parable of the blind men touching different parts of an elephant and all having the conviction of being right, we perceive elephants differently depending where we stand. Rural people who live close to elephants know a very different beast from policymakers who live in faraway cities. Animal lovers, like myself, who might see gentle giants, may have no comprehension of the real danger. So that is the first part of my talk about what is HEC, and then I'm going to take us to Botswana, but I thought I'd pause for a moment to see if anyone has any comments or questions.
Sure, we have a question in the chat. Excuse me while I scroll back up.
Okay.
So how are Botswana elephants protected from poaching for tusks?
So Botswana has a very strict policy against poachers. They have a history of shooting to kill poachers. It's very much a military effort to protect elephants. But one of the biggest strengths for elephants, and I'll get to this a little bit later in the talk, is Botswana is very, very sparsely inhabited. It's a country the size of Texas that has a population of only 2 million people. And so much of Botswana is quite remote. And that means that it's really hard even for the most erstwhile poachers to get there. It makes it also very hard to monitor these vast areas But in some ways, Botswana has been a standout in Africa, a holdout rather, against poaching, if only because it's so remote, but also because the government has taken a very strong, almost militaristic stand against poaching.
Thank you. Do they use chili fences or bees to mitigate HEC?
Yes, I love that question. Thank you. They use chili fences, chili peppers. I'll get to that in just a little bit. We are trying beehives as well, as you surely know from your question. That's worked quite effectively in East Africa. Lucy King has led that effort, the beehives and the elephants, because elephants are quite averse to being stung by bees, and even just the sound. It hasn't worked so far quite as effectively in Botswana, if only, well, for a number of reasons. The bee population doesn't seem to be as strong as in East Africa. Culturally, there isn't a history of keeping bees. And then the bees are not active at night, which is primarily when the elephants are active and primarily when they're most inclined to enter people's fields. So even if there were bees and if there were beekeeping history, it might not be effective at deterring elephants. But that's a great question.
Thank you. One last question before we move on. I lived in Namibia for 14 years, and I wonder if there has been progress with elephant corridors to channel elephants towards water away from the fields.
Wonderful. Oh, I'd love to hear about your life in Namibia. It's such a beautiful country. We have close collaboration with partners in Namibia trying to connect corridors. I'll share a bit with you about corridors for elephants we've established in this part of Botswana, which is right on the border with Namibia. And so precisely our idea is to create that connectivity between countries, because we have seen that elephants, of course, they don't obey these political boundaries and they move in and out of Namibia and Botswana all the time. So I will get to that a little bit. I'm happy to talk more about that when we close.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have 2 more questions that we will address on the next break.
Okay. Okay, are you closing that valve, Cyril?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, wonderful. Thank you for the questions. So now I want to take us to Botswana. It's the nation with the largest population of elephants in the world. 1/3 of the total population of African elephants live in Botswana. 80% of those elephants roam outside of protected areas. So in northern Botswana, the Okavango Delta is especially important for elephants. The Okavango River enters Botswana from Angola, passing through Namibia, and it becomes a delta that empties into the Kalahari Desert. So this water source in a desert nation is a true oasis for big concentrations of elephants and lots of other wildlife. This is actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So I'm going to be talking about a part of the Okavango. It's called the Eastern Okavango Panhandle. This is a region about the size of Greater Yellowstone. But importantly, what I want you to know is it's not a park. This is not a protected area. It's basically a region that's defined by its boundaries. There's a buffalo fence or a veterinary fence to the south that's meant to keep wildlife and livestock separate, a border fence with Namibia, and the river itself. So these limit easy migration or movement either by people or elephants. So there's this area where we have 18,000 elephants and 16,000 people living in 15 villages. And there's this road I'll be talking about that connects the villages and follows the water. This is what it looks like on the ground. This is the road I just referred to. I'll be referring to the woodlands in the north and the water of the delta to the south, the permanent water of the delta. And you'll see photos, including that composite image I shared of elephants crossing that road between the villages. So though elephant populations have been plummeting around the world, elephants in Botswana are thriving. The population has tripled since 1990, now to an estimated 130 to 150,000 elephants. In the Panhandle alone, the population has quadrupled since 1996. There's a population growth rate of 9% per year, which cannot be accounted for in natural birth and death cycles. By the way, the more you look at this photo, I don't know how well you can see it, the more elephants you should see. I photographed this watering hole from a spotting plane, and we estimated 300 to 400 elephants around this water. So it's not clear why the rate of growth for elephants in this part of the world is so high, especially in the Panhandle, but it seems that this area is something of a refuge or a sanctuary for elephants coming in from Namibia, Angola, and Zambia, where the rates of poaching and habitat loss are greater. So elephants have always been in the Panhandle, but at least in this century, not in such great numbers. So that means that elders in their 60s, 70s, and olders have no memory of having seen so many elephants, much less knowing how to share space with them or stay safe around them. You can't get to the villages of the Eastern Panhandle except by a charter plane or many days of canoe through the Delta. There is a road that extends along the western side of the Delta, and if you drive 5 hours from the town of Maun, which is like a gateway town village to the safari industry in the Okavango, and if you drive north to the village of Chikawe, then you take a ferry across the Okavango River, and the locals will tell you you're going overseas. So that's in a landlocked nation, and that should tell you a lot about the Panhandle and how people think about the Panhandle. In many ways, it's just so cut off from the rest of Botswana. The capital city of Gaborone, where most people live in Botswana, feels like a whole world away. And people here in many ways feel quite forgotten. For thousands of years, this has been homeland of the San people, hunters and gatherers of the Kalahari. But more recently, there are other cultural groups here too, mainly the Hambukushu and the Baye. If you were to drive that stretch of road that connects the villages, it's 170 kilometers, you would hear people speaking 5 different languages. You'd find a real mix of traditions and livelihoods. People they live at a subsistence level, so they collect grasses and reeds from the Delta. They also gather wild jackalberry fruits and water lilies. They fish, they raise cattle, and they farm. Most people are farmers, but farming here is so hard. It's especially tough. The soil they're farming in is sand. It's basically sand, as you can hopefully see in this picture. They depend on rainfall in this desert. And rainfall is increasingly unpredictable with climate change. So people here make do with very little. Most people don't have things like water pumps for irrigation. Even fewer have any kind of motor vehicle to transport their produce or water. Most of the land here is tribal, and it falls under the governance of the state. So basically what that means is people are allocated land through government offices that are called land boards. And so land overseers tell farmers, this is where you can put your farm, this is where you can put your piece of land, this is where you can live. So that detail will become more relevant as I go on. The government of Botswana is very strong. As I mentioned, it's twice the size of Texas with a population of just 2 million people. And they have diamonds. They have it's a fairly wealthy country by African standards because they have revenue from diamonds. Many have called Botswana a kind of welfare state. So there are numerous subsidies and there's like a labor program that offers short-term employment and things like drought relief. And importantly, there's a compensation scheme for people who've experienced crop losses from elephants. And I'll get to that in a moment too. So in summary, the Eastern Panhandle, it's a really beautiful place full of beautiful people. And despite that government support, it's just really hard to live here. People are very isolated, very little access to amenities, and they're trying to farm in Kalahari sand with unpredictable rainfall. There's some commerce and employment associated with the safari industry, but otherwise there are virtually no markets here. The main resources people have, sort of outside resources, are cell phones and donkey carts. And they live surrounded by thousands of elephants. So at certain times of the year, just when the rains have stopped and people are starting to harvest from their fields, the elephants begin to move south from like that pool that I showed earlier with the 300 to 400 elephants around that watering hole. Those begin to dry up and the elephants begin to move south to the permanent water of the Delta. As they get closer to the water, they have to move through the villages. And so as they're crossing the road, they might hear people shouting at them, banging drums at them. They might hear dogs barking at them. They might see fires burning. They might smell chili pepper bombs, which I will get to in a moment, that farmers have put out for them. But they need to get to the water, and they use distinct pathways they have followed for generations. So they're smart about it. Of course, they're smart about it. They tend to move under the cover of night. And because they're trying to avoid people and they're trying to be safe, they move through the villages at dusk and at night, and they also cluster in big numbers for safety. So some elephants are what we might call habitual crop raiders, or I would say crop eaters, meaning that they're going to target farmers' fields, that they've learned where the fields are and they're going to go in and eat. But most, we've learned from my colleague Anna Songhurst's work here, who's the elephant biologist on our team, most elephants here tend to be opportunistic. So if a field is near or in their pathway, then they might go in and eat. If they smell a pumpkin, then they might go for it. Anna learned in her PhD work, she found that the distance between the farmer's field and one of the main elephant pathways was the biggest predictor of whether an elephant would eat crops. Fields within 1 kilometer of a pathway were twice as likely to be visited by an elephant. So millet is the preferred crop elephants like, and it's mostly adult male elephants, or the bulls, who enter fields. 700 or 800 fields in this area per year are affected. And this is the main manifestation of HEC in this part of the world. But conflict involves death too. In the past 8 years, about 20 elephants per year have been killed in relation to HEC in this part of Botswana. And those are the ones we know. Sometimes elephants are shot or injured and then they go off in the bush. This is an example of an elephant who had been shot sometime before, and you can see he's been grievously injured and is suffering an infection in his hind leg. He had to be put down by the wildlife officer. It's actually quite hard to kill an elephant. We can talk about that later. Maybe we shouldn't linger on that. But I want to tell you that in the same period of 8 years, 9 people were killed in this part of Botswana. Tragically, a couple years ago, 2 elderly men were killed in the same month. They were, in both cases, different places in the Delta. They were walking along that main road in the early morning hours, and we're not sure exactly what happened, but it seems they came upon, unwittingly, female elephants with calves and were trampled. So of course, when that happens, it's just completely devastating. When an elephant kills someone, the death is like a blow that just reverberates throughout the panhandle, and that is spiking fear and resentment, and also retaliatory killing of elephants, both by government wildlife officers and by villagers. So I want to pause again, because from here, now that I've introduced what HEC is and showed you, I hope, a picture of the Eastern Panhandle, I want to move into Ecoexist and the work that we're doing. But I thought I'd pause for any questions.
Wonderful, Amanda. We have a couple. One of our attendees says, when I lived in South Africa, Botswana was very protective of elephants, but with the recent president does not appreciate the elephants and sold permits to Safari Club International. Have you noticed anything related to this?
Yes, you've opened the big can of worms. I love having participants in our conversation who have experience in Southern Africa. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about your time in South Africa. So yes, that is a whole big conversation, but Botswana has a long history of trophy hunting of elephants. A number of years ago, maybe 10 years ago, President Khama initiated a moratorium on trophy hunting. It was always meant to be temporary. And when the new president came into office 2-3 years ago, President Masisi, he lifted that moratorium on trophy hunting. There is a very strong sense in Botswana that there are, quote, too many elephants. We in the outside may look at that and say that's just wonderful for Botswana, but for people who live there, it's quite a burden, and there's a lot of resentment and frustration and a sense that the rest of the world doesn't care about the people living there. So this is in some ways Masisi's effort, strongly supported by most people in Botswana, to somehow try to address that population. So the trophy hunting has come back. That's a quota of about 300 elephants out of 130 or 150,000 per year. And the idea is that revenues from that activity go back to local communities, the very local communities I'm talking about here. Very, very controversial. I have a billion feelings about it that maybe we can discuss after this. But it's a complex question. It's a very complex question that involves all kinds of issues related to social justice and geopolitics. And, you know, it's not just should we kill an elephant or not. It's actually quite a complicated issue.
Thank you. Any evidence that the elephants have smaller tusks due to the elimination of big talkers?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you. There has been some evidence showing not only smaller tusks over time, but also increasing incidence of tusklessness in elephants, which is a natural phenomenon among some elephants. Some are just born without tusks. And apparently that is, I'm not the elephant biologist on the team, but apparently that's increasing. And some are suggesting that that is somehow a response to the ivory trade and human-elephant conflict, especially the ivory trade.
That's very interesting. What other predators besides humans prey on elephants?
Oh, there is really no other except in Botswana. There are examples, relatively rare. It does happen in other parts of Africa and certainly in Botswana. But there are examples of prides of lions taking down elephants, especially in times of high stress and drought and heavy drought years, especially in a part of Botswana called Savuti. If you ever saw the Planet Earth, there's some incredible and quite hard to watch footage of a pride of lions taking down elephants. But other than that, elephants really have no predators. You know, calves can certainly be taken by a pack of wild dogs, but it's relatively rare, and that's partly why elephants are so feared. Is they're so powerful that they have few rivals.
Okay, we have 3 more questions in the chat, and then after that we will wait until the end of the presentations to give adequate time to the presenter. So, given your research on proximity to elephant paths, why doesn't the government assign farmland that isn't close to those paths?
Yes, wow. I love your question. Thank you guys for these beautiful questions. I'm actually going to get to that. That's part of the work we've done at Ecoexist, is identify the main elephant pathways, have them protected, and then thinking about understanding where the elephants go in the biggest numbers and most frequently, where are the safer places, relatively safer places for people to farm. And so that's exactly the work we've done with the land boards that I mentioned. And so thank you for thinking ahead and getting it. I'll talk more about that.
So I have a participant next to me that is asking, what is a buffalo fence?
Yeah, I don't know why it's called buffalo fence. I guess it's meant to keep the Cape buffalo away from the livestock, but that's what they call in Botswana, essentially the veterinary cordon fences that are meant to keep the wildlife separate from livestock, primarily to prevent the transmission of disease. So it's called buffalo fence. Yeah.
Has anyone explored the possibility of relocating Botswana elephants to other parts of Africa where they've been extirpated?
Yes, this is an idea that comes up quite a lot, and in some ways maybe the easiest way to think about that, because it's just incredibly challenging to think about, how translocating thousands of elephants, which is the number it would take to really make some kind of significant difference. But the idea, and I'll address this a little bit at the end too, is to encourage think more about the threats to elephants in the areas around Botswana, primarily in Angola, so that those age-old migratory corridors can open again, and that elephants can return safely to those parts of Southern Africa, so that they're not really, crowded in smaller and smaller places that they feel are refuges, like just northern Botswana. So the idea is to open the borders again and make it safe for elephants to move again. There are examples of elephants being translocated by helicopter and such. That hasn't been discussed quite as much, just because the numbers, or it would just be untenable, impractical to move thousands of elephants. I will say that many people in Botswana will often say to me, when we talk about the geopolitics of elephant conservation, and they'll say, Amanda, it's just lovely that everybody in the United States loves elephants. Why don't you take them? Why don't you take a few thousand of them? And that would alleviate some of the pressure on us, and you can have them there. And they're speaking facetiously, but not completely. I think they'd like to alleviate some of the pressure they feel in Botswana.
Thank you. And the last question for this session is, what is the organization that you're with? And could we, as the audience, join your expeditions?
So I'm a professor at Texas A&M, but I am also co-founder of this organization called Ecoexist, which I'm about to share with you. And we don't currently have expeditions. It's something we've talked about as a way to support the work we're doing. And also, one of our biggest goals is to raise awareness of human-elephant conflict and help people understand how they can support people who live with elephants, and in that way support elephants. So I will get to some examples of how you can help, and maybe in the future we'll have some expeditions, but I hope that I'll be able to keep in touch with everyone who wants to keep in touch with me after this talk, so that if we create something like that in the future, you'll be the first to know.
Wonderful. That's all for now.
Okay, you guys, those are amazing questions. Okay, so now that I've talked about HEC and the Panhandle, I want to share some of the work we've done as Ecoexist. So we are a small nonprofit organization. We're based in Botswana, and the work we do is really in close collaboration with lots of people in those villages and throughout government offices in Botswana. Our work is basically to reduce HEC. And when we started in 2011, we had some understanding of the dimensions of HEC. Anna Songhurst had done her PhD on that very topic in this part of Botswana. So we kind of knew where, when, and how of conflict, and we wanted to get at the root causes, the why. So much of the work on HEC in the world, not just in Botswana to that point, had focused and has focused on finding ways to alleviate conflict. It's tended to be reactive. So that's things like helping farmers keep elephants out of fields, with chili peppers or beehives, compensating people after they've experienced damage, or keeping elephants separate from people, either through fences or parks. So these are all pieces of the solution, but we wanted to turn the question around. How can we proactively think about coexistence? What will it take for 18,000 elephants to share a landscape with 16,000 people? How can we address the needs of both species? So lightning strike, we're really lucky to meet Howard Buffett, one of Warren Buffett's sons, and he gave us tremendous support to develop a 5-year plan to reduce HEC in the Panhandle. Of course, it takes lifetimes to do that. It's going to be many lifetimes to maybe we'll never eliminate HEC, but our purpose in this time has been to create a foundation for coexistence. So we always say we take a holistic approach, and we're looking at conflict in all the possible ways: ecological, social, political, economic, and we're just trying to get at the root causes. This will be maybe my most wonky slide, but I want to take you to some of the root causes of HEC. One is purely ecological. It's a competition for resources. So increasing populations of people and elephants and has resulted in heightened competition for water and food and space. So if you look at population growth rates in this part of Botswana over the same time period, you see that the population growth rate of elephants is far outpacing that of humans, but nonetheless, both are growing, and that increasing paired population growth leads to competition. So that's one of the roots. A second root is what we call conflicting land use policies. So when the Ministry of Wildlife doesn't communicate with the Ministry of Agriculture, who doesn't communicate with the Land Board, that means that farmers' fields are unwittingly allocated right in the middle of elephant pathways, and that can really exacerbate conflict. Another root is what we think about as dependency. So I've talked about Botswana's sort of welfare state approach to conflict. They compensate farmers after damage has occurred, and that's a really good and important thing to do. But it can also dampen local incentive to try to address conflict. And then there are always problems associated with that compensation. There's delays, there's underpayment, there's big bureaucracy, and that just leads to frustration. So farmers get so frustrated, and that worsens the negative feelings. And remember that perception is part of conflict. Connected with this is a lack of voice and capacity. The people who live closest to elephants are the people who have the least amount of sway in policy making. In many ways, they feel quite powerless, and that's part of the conflict as well. Lastly, we talk about a kind of basic injustice. Elephants bring more costs than benefits to people who live with them. People in Botswana, in northern Botswana, living surrounded by elephants, they know that elephants bring a lot of revenue to the nation of Botswana. They know that safari tourism is a big industry, and they call the elephants the government's cattle. Very little of that revenue from the tourism industry reaches people in these villages, and that feeds further resentment. So we know from lots of research that tolerance of elephants decreases when people experience economic hardships. So that all of these root causes is what led to our mission, and our mission is to support the lives and livelihoods of people who share space with elephants while considering the needs of elephants and their habitats. So I'll share just some examples of what we're doing. We start by thinking at a landscape level, and it's one that's shared. So we ask, what space do elephants need, and what space do people need? And if you can remember some things that I've mentioned already, elephants use particular pathways when they come through the villages. They try to avoid people. They tend to be opportunistic. So if a farmer's field is close to their pathway, they're more likely to venture in. The land board allocates land to people, advising them where they can plant their fields. And farming is really hard in this part of the world, in Kalahari. People have very few resources other than each other and their own labor. So given all of that, our first strategy for establishing coexistence has rested on the idea of protecting those main movement pathways. So in her PhD work, Anna Songhurst identified over 100 pathways on that stretch of road that the elephants use most often. This entailed tracking the elephants on the ground, talking with people because people know where the elephants go, learning where the elephants go and when, and how they move through the villages. So she categorized those pathways according to the frequency of use and the number of elephants using them. So in this map, you can see the blue are the pathways that are used relatively little. The red is like the super highway, the super elephant highway. And then the yellow orange ones are used quite often. If you can eyeball where there's yellow orange ones are, try to memorize those, and you'll see in this next image that those became what we now identify as elephant corridors. So this followed lots of consultation with government offices and tribal leaders, and with beautiful support from USAID. The 13 most frequently used elephant pathways became corridors. Here's another map that's showing the same thing. These yellow lines are the elephant corridors. And importantly, they were officially recognized with road signs and written in policy. So what that means is that land boards will no longer allocate land for fields or settlements in these areas. And that means that the corridors, the main corridors, will remain free and clear for elephants. And I always like to say it's so nice that the elephants are so smart that they know how to read and they follow the signs. So there's a flip side to this, and one of you alluded to this already so beautifully, and that's the social side. So with the corridors identified, farmers and land overseers have more information now about where to plant fields. The very same planning process that went into identifying where the elephants go identified the best arable lands for farmers. So it's now in these areas that people are working together in what we call cluster fields, basically pooling their ideas and their resources to protect their crops together from elephants. This has the advantage of preventing further fragmentation of the landscape. So instead of every farmer protecting her own field with fences and breaking up the habitat, people now farm in a cluster, a safe distance from the main corridors. So now there are 65,000 hectares of land identified outside of the 13 main elephant movement corridors. Recognized as relatively good land. It's still soil, it's still sand, but it's relatively the best land, relatively safe from elephants. And right now there are just over 300 farmers working together in these areas called cluster fields. So 4 things make the cluster fields powerful. When farmers work together as an association, they get support from the government for fencing, electric fencing, which is really powerful to keep elephants out. So instead of waiting for the government to compensate them for lost crops, this is a way for farmers to be very proactive, taking charge of their own fields, and then also getting support from the government. One of the main tools they use, aside from the electrified fencing to keep elephants out, is the chili peppers. So they make what are called chili pepper bombs. They mix dried chili pepper seeds, ironically, with elephant dung, and they put it around the fields, and those chili bombs can burn through much of the night, and elephants just can't tolerate the strong smell. In these cluster fields, people practice what's called conservation agriculture, and that's basically taking that really poor sandy soil and trying to build up nutrients through a series of techniques that involves digging basins and mulching. It's very labor intensive, but it's a way of enabling people to produce in a very relatively smaller area of land that's easier to protect from elephants. And then they can stay in this piece of land over longer periods of time, which means they're not pushing further and further into wild elephant habitat. And then lastly, when they practice all of this together, cluster farmers earn a kind of premium on what they produce. It's called elephant aware. And we're busy taking that and turning it into value-added products, which I'll share in just a moment. So in this landscape approach with the elephant corridors on one side and the cluster fields on the other, we're also trying to address the basic economic question, the social injustice question, the fact that people here bear the weight of living with so many elephants. So our work in this regard has been to facilitate private sector support, finding ways for people to gain benefit from the fact that they live close to so many elephants. And we call this building an elephant economy. This has included developing community-based tours and cultural events tied with locally crafted products under the banner and brand Life with Elephants. So our aim is to put a spotlight on this part of the world with the message, if you love elephants, the best way to protect them is to support the people who live with them. So each year we've hosted a series of Life with Elephants art, performance, and craft competitions and celebrations. The basic idea is to bring people together to exchange experiences and learn from each other and have fun. The winning performers earn cash prizes and certificates from a panel of Who's Got Talent type judges, usually the village chiefs. We always see the best elephant costumes fashioned only from the most basic materials, but brought to life with so much creativity and with so much knowledge of elephants. Here are posters advertising the event in recent years. In the past couple of years, we brought the winning artists together with a professional choreographer and playwright and a whole dance company from the capital of Gaborone. And the artists spend a week together, weaving together their poetry and skits and songs into one beautiful stage production. And we've tried to make it as professional as we can, creating a playbill, professional lighting and sound. It's sort of our version of The Lion King, but with elephants. I'm working on getting it to Broadway. So this isn't just about generating revenue or employment, but also about showcasing the talents of people. People have every reason in this part of the world to be frustrated and angry with elephants, but there's also, I want you to know, there's also so much reverence and awe for elephants. People have complicated feelings about elephants. It's not only that they like or dislike them. They feel a lot of pride in the Botswana elephants. If anything, they'll say it's the Namibian elephants that are the problem. It's always the neighbor. So it's through these events we hope people can gain a sense of pride too for their experience and knowledge of how to live with elephants. The Panhandle is loaded with incredibly talented visual artists. These are some of the winning Life with Elephants pieces we used as, we created an art exhibit in the town of Maun. We developed a Life with Elephants tour, and this is for tourists in the nearby safari camps who can come in and learn how people share space with elephants. They see how people create chili bombs. They see what an elephant pathway looks like, what a watch hut next to a field looks like. This is a brochure created by the local community. I mentioned we're creating value-added products. My colleagues, Anna and Graham, are now entrepreneurs, and they recently opened a craft brewery in the town of Maun. And this beer is marked by the label of Elephant Aware and is brewed with Elephant Aware millet and with the story of ingredients sourced by people in those cluster farms. We are working with a cooperative of basket weavers to develop a new line of crafts that feature elephants, and then all the revenue goes back to the artist. We've begun selling these baskets on a trial basis with the fair trade company 10,000 Villages, and also World Wildlife Fund. Just this year, the winter catalog for World Wildlife Fund featured these baskets, which was a huge coup. So all of these elephant economy ideas are meant to support and reinforce the corridors and also the cluster fields in that shared landscape. Everything we do is based on research. We have had 10 graduate students, 5 from Botswana, mostly women, connected with Texas A&M, Oxford, and universities in Botswana and South Africa. The data we're gathering is socially, ecological, economic, and spatial. It's all aimed at getting a big picture understanding of HEC and the opportunities for coexistence. So as the anthropologist on the team who's supposed to be focusing on people, I will admit that the most exciting research is with elephants. A big part of our work has been understanding the seasonal movements of elephants, seeing where they go and when, trying to discern why, and then what the implications are for conflict and management. You can maybe see that this elephant has a collar. This is Anna in the helicopter there, and I'm in the spotter plane photographing it. It's all very James Bond, this work. Since 2014, we collared 40 elephants, and most of those collars sent data points every hour for 4 years. This is what all those data points look like, and this is a whole other talk that Dr. Songhurst should give, and I'm gonna see if maybe she could give a talk to all of you. She's the elephant expert. But there's so much to say about the range of movements, the variations between breeding herds and bulls, the distance they travel as far north as Angola, in and out of Namibia, in and out of the heart of the Delta, through villages and safari camps. So that data is feeding into various scientific publications, yes, but it's also informing management in a wider region known as the Okavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area. In collaboration with World Wildlife Fund, we're collating data from our collared elephants with collared elephants in Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So we're trying to see how things like border fences and corridors on different sides of the border are influencing where elephants go and how they're distributed. So I want to get to your questions, but I have just a few more minutes, and I want to try to wrap it up here so we can get to the questions. But I want to get to that last part about why should we care? Sometimes I have trouble with the so what question. To me, it's enough to know that elephants and people are struggling to coexist. But my hairdresser, of all people, asked me quite innocently one time. She said, "What is the purpose of an elephant? What would happen if we didn't have elephants?" So if we're talking about ecosystem function, I might say, well, elephants are environmental engineers. They're the largest terrestrial mammal. They shape the earth. They forge landscapes and pathways. They dig water holes and create habitats for other animals. We should say they are keystone species. If we didn't have elephants, well, perhaps some grasslands would revert to forest. There would be a whole other cascade of ecological effects. But more philosophically, I think we would lose something of ourselves. We are living in the what's called the Anthropocene, a time when all ecosystems are inextricably social and ecological. Humans have influenced every system on the planet. And that might make us feel invincible. But when we lose a species so beloved and so iconic, beings who share so much life history and social story with us, I think we lose ourselves too. And why should we care about the people? I assume that's obvious, but even if we don't care, we need to learn from them. Their knowledge and experiences are really invaluable to understand how to be with other beings on the planet. If the Botswana can coexist with elephants, then we, the rest of us, should be able to figure it out with other species, ones that are not nearly as destructive or dangerous. And finally, some things I have learned from the Okavango, so many things, but I tried to boil it down in this one slide. Protected areas are important, but we need to focus our conservation efforts on supporting and learning from and collaborating with people where they live. Rather than separating people and nature, we need to focus on coexistence. And that means our work needs to be about local institutions, policies, and incentives. Human-elephant conflict is complicated, and the solutions need to be too. So we need to try lots of things all at the same time with lots of different kinds of people leading the way. Certain kinds of people tend to get ignored, like the people of the Okavango. So I always try to emphasize that we need to listen. We need to hear their voices more loudly and more often in national and international conversations about elephants and human-elephant conflict. I'll close with a quote from Aldo Leopold. Conservation without a keen realization of its vital conflicts fails to rate as authentic human drama. It falls to the level of a mere utopian dream. So I hope you can take away from this some new insights on elephants, maybe a glimpse of the realities for the people of Botswana, some of the vital conflicts they experience, and some of their hopes for an easier shared coexistence. these are just some of the organizations who support our work and who I want to thank. And then I want to, with a belly full of laughter, thank you all for your beautiful questions and open it up for discussion if we have time for it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Amanda.
Thank you.
This was an outstanding presentation.
Yes.
I would like to go through the questions that we received in the chat before we engage the new ones. So the first thing I want to say is, what is the purpose of the border fence between Botswana and Namibia?
You know, that's a great question. It's funny, I'm not sure that I know the answer. I've always just, oh, it's a border fence. I think it is primarily functioning like a veterinary fence as well, like a buffalo fence. Because the Botswana and the Namibians talk about it, how effective it is for preventing the movement of wildlife. So it's like a veterinary fence as well. But there are lots of gaps in the fence, and wildlife is always moving across it. In fact, we have a paper under review right now showing, oh, I wish I had the data to show you this incredible map that shows that the elephant bulls move back and forth across that border fence. But the females, the breeding herds with their calves, they go right up to the fence on both sides. So we have data from Namibia and we have the collar data from Botswana. And you see the Namibian females and their herds come right to the fence on both sides. And meanwhile, the bulls are just moving all over. It's pretty fascinating.
Thank you. So climate has not been mentioned as the root cause of some of these issues. Is that not affecting the Okavango Delta area?
Oh gosh, you're so right. You're so right. So in that slide where I said, oh, it's kind of a wonky slide, you know, climate change should be in there. We absolutely recognize how the increasing unpredictability of rainfall and the timing of rainfall and the amount of rainfall from year to year is making it that much harder for people to plant their fields and to know the timing. And then people are also saying increasingly, even just in the 10 years I've been working there, that they see elephants moving closer and closer and closer, earlier and earlier and earlier to the permanent water of the Delta. So there's just increasing amounts of stress, both on the part of the elephants and on the part of the farmers at that crucial time when everyone's waiting for the rains. And so you're absolutely right. Climate change is definitely a root cause of conflict.
Thank you. How often are herds of elephants using these corridors? Daily, weekly?
Oh yeah, sure. It's daily. So certain times of year, especially, you know, right at the time around March, April, May, skipped May for some reason, right when people are harvesting their crops, that's when the elephants start to move in big numbers on a daily basis. But throughout the year, they're moving back and forth between the permanent water of the Delta and the woodlands. But wow, in big numbers into July. That one slide I showed of the elephants moving under the cover of night, we watched, oh gosh, I'm gonna say 500 elephants cross that road in a span of about 10 minutes. So they really congregate in big numbers, almost like forming a parade before they, you know, put themselves at the risk of crossing that road. But it's daily, it's a daily back and forth.
Can the local residents transfer skills to the safari industry?
Yes, you know, the question about trophy hunting and the complicatedness the complexity of it that I mentioned earlier, you know, one of the biggest needs in Botswana to address conflict and the resentment people have of elephants is reform in the tourism industry. Botswana has this incredible state-of-the-art safari industry, and if I recommend everybody go if you can possibly afford it. I mean, it costs upwards of $1,000 per person per night to stay in one of these luxury camps. It's the experience of a lifetime. But so little of that goes back to people in these villages. These are foreign owned in many cases, big safari companies, and they hire people from the local villages at kind of a minimum wage. But there's so much need for real tourism reform, finding ways for people to bring their knowledge and experience to these operations, that the operations are increasingly owned fully by people in local communities or in partnership with these companies. So, and I think if that reform were to take place, then people would be less inclined to say, let's bring back trophy hunting. They just need to see some more benefits from the fact they live surrounded by thousands of elephants. And I get it.
Do you ever face resistance from Panhandle residents to the ideas of elephant economy or cluster fields?
You know, I love that question too. People in this part of the world, you know, the overseas thing, they feel so neglected in so many ways. And so it's not the kind of place where people see, oh, you know, here come these foreign researchers, here comes this white anthropologist talking to me about, you know, elephant economy. Not at all. If anything, they are so open to ideas and they want to be heard. And so that's why, you know, I emphasize listening. In many cases, you know, we can't, as a team, solve the challenges people experience, but a big part of helping is listening, is listening. You know, the picture of when I was talking about human-human conflict and there was the older gentleman standing up and shaking his fist, that was in a community assembly. And we have sat through hundreds of hours with people just standing up and talking about how angry they are about the injustices and how they don't get support, even though the world loves elephants. Well, where's the support for them? And so, you know, there's a lot of receptivity to, can we try something? And we always start with, you know, what are you already doing? And what would you like to do, rather than just coming and, you know, imposing our ideas.
Thank you. Some of our attendees would like to get resources from you that are a little more recent. If you could please follow up with us and share some of those resources, I would love to pass it along to all of them.
Absolutely.
And when is the best time to visit the Okavango?
Every day, all year long. So the best time, you know, so financially, the hardest time, the most expensive time is the best time, which is in June and July and August, and those are the winter months. And that's when, and those are the dry months. And so it's quite cool at night and cool during, even chilly. And you can see lots of wildlife because there isn't a lot of vegetation. And then the animals are really congregated in bigger numbers around the available water. So it's the dry season, it's the winter season. So it's a great time to go, but it's also the most expensive time. A time that I love to recommend is November, December. It's the start of the rainy season. And so it's very verdant and lush. And so it's a little harder to see the animals, but you see lots of baby animals. It's very much the springtime. And so you see just these huge herds of impala on these little toothpick legs and just all the babies. It's a beautiful time. And then it's less expensive. You can get good deals. And yeah, it's just beautiful.
Thank you. There was a question about why the signs are in English. I can't, oh yes, just curious why the elephant corridor signs are in English. Do the villagers all speak English as a first language?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And someone else asked me that recently too. And so government, one of the official languages in Botswana is English. The second official language is Setswana. And then in the villages, as I mentioned, in northern Botswana, they speak Sahambokushu and Siye and Sasarwa. And you're correct that there are quite a number of people who don't speak English, but they can all read that sign, and it's most official signs in Botswana are in English. And in fact, those signs are not Ecoexist signs. We facilitated it, but that's from the Tawana Land Board that put up those signs. But I think it would be really important to, we've actually talked about this, is creating more signs that are, this elephant corridor is represented in all the languages that people speak in the Panhandle. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. So as far as questions from the chat are concerned, I think we have touched them all, but I want to invite Steve Lunker, that has been waiting the longer for that, and then Susan Hutner is to share their own stories that were shared in the chat, but I think it'll be most effective if you use your voice and if you're comfortable with.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. I also had a question for you. I read a few months ago that there was a large die-off of elephants in the Okavango, and I was wondering, is that due to anthrax? And that was my first question, and maybe I'll let you answer that, and then I can get into my own experiences there.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Yeah, in fact, where those elephants died is in the Eastern Okavango Panhandle. There were a number of elephants who died in our camp. So my team, Anna and Graham, they engaged with the government over many months doing all the aerial surveys and trying to, collecting samples to send off to laboratories for testing. It's not anthrax. They ruled out human-elephant conflict. It's not that locals were poisoning on purpose. There seems to have been some toxin in the water, but it's quite a mystery because other species did not die. We did not see die-off from cattle, or there are plenty of lions and hyenas in this part of Botswana. We did not see deaths from those species, just elephants. So it seems to have been some kind of toxin in the water, but it's still quite a mystery. But the dying has stopped. There haven't been new carcasses found since April or May, I believe.
Yeah. So I worked as an exploration geologist in the Zambezi Escarpment in Zimbabwe. We were exploring for platinum. I was working for an Australian company, BHP, and also doing some research projects, and had a number of encounters with elephants, some not so pleasant. I guess the one that's most in memory, there was a male that was a musk, and it was very ornery and had been following and chasing finally there was a granite kopje. For those who had not been in Southern Africa, that's a granite hill. And elephants don't climb, fortunately. And I spent literally 7 hours up on top of that hill. So that elephant got tired of snorting at me and stopped.
Wow,
yeah,
that's terrifying.
That was really unbelievable. But the most frightening experience I ever had was buddies and I guess colleagues and friends of mine from BHP. We'd go into the Okavango and we'd hire a guide and give him a koro. Those are the canoes, the flat bottom canoes, and just follow the guide and explore the waterways and the wildlife in the islands. Typically camp out, primitive camping in the islands. And I remember having to go one night, I had to do my thing. And I was sitting there squatting down. There was a herd of elephants nearby moving closer and closer. And all I could think is being found the next morning, crushed in my own excrement. That was my first experience.
Gosh, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
So you understand how scary they are. I mean, you have been around elephants.
Size. I remember that male at the bottom of the kopje. They're huge. They're humongous. And you said a tusk. They would have killed me. But I did have a colleague, an Irish colleague. He wasn't. I don't think he was too bright, and he was crushed to death around a poles. I mean, they found a camera on him with some photographs of a mama with some babies. I think he got too close. But, yeah.
So scary.
That's been my experiences. So
yeah,
anyway.
no, thank you for sharing that. I'd love to hear more about your work.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, but it was a fantastic talk. I love it. Brought back a lot of memories. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm sure. Thanks.
I love your work. Yeah. Keep it up.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. I would like to invite Susan to share her story with Amanda.
Oh, hi. I don't think that my video's on, but that's all right. I basically was wondering about the tourism issue that you raised, the tourism dollars going to local communities. I was in graduate school in the 80s doing African studies. And when they talked about environmental issues, one of the big movements on then was to make sure that tourist dollars, and I mean, I think this is true worldwide, that tourist dollars from things like the Okavango Delta and various places in Africa where there's a lot of animal tourism got to the local communities. And I mean, I've traveled in East Africa, and at least the group that I was traveling with, you know, for tourist travel, I mean, there were a lot of ways that tourist dollars were siphoned off for the local community, so that they would be more interested in conservation. And I'm really surprised. I mean, it just seems like Botswana has a lot of pretty good policies, environmental policies. And that just seems like a huge gap for me, you know, 40 years later, to hear that there's still this problem of the dollars not going to local people.
Yeah, I could not agree more, Susan. It is such it's a huge blind spot, the size of a population of 130,000 elephants, this problem. And it's just, you know, in some ways, I think it's just the power of these. I don't know if I can fully convey how powerful and wealthy these safari companies are. They're massive corporations. These are not, you know, little safari camps. These are they're in some ways maybe more powerful than the government of Botswana itself. And so I agree with you. It's just, you know, in a nation that is so progressive in so many ways about thinking about supporting people who live with wildlife, there's just all the benefits go to these safari companies. And they, you know, if you look at their marketing materials, they're going to tell you that they have these joint venture partnerships with local communities and that they're always hiring locals. And, you know, it's all very beautiful, but it's a lie. I'm sorry to say. Most of my work, by the way, has focused on ecotourism in the Amazon. And places in the Amazon are just light years ahead of the very thing you're talking about, Susan, thinking about how tourism can be a source of support for local communities, can be a way to build stewardship of wildlife, can be a way to address social inequality, you know, can work as a tool in so many ways. And I think in some ways, one of the reasons it hasn't happened in Botswana, you know, your question of why 40 years later is it still an issue, is they can get away with it. Botswana has so much wildlife that they don't even need to think about how do we bring in the cultural side? You know, tourism just generates huge amounts of money, and they have incredibly reliable numbers of wildlife. So they can guarantee if you go to Botswana, you're going to see a leopard, you're going to see prides of lions, you're going to see wild dogs, you're going to see all of it. So they can be quite relaxed in terms of thinking about how do we do tourism right. So they have, frankly, it's quite a colonial model to old school turn of the century safari tourism. But you know, there's so many people in Botswana who are asking the very same question you are, and including the president himself. President Masisi is very much about let's turn this around and let's make it really about the people.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. You know, one thing I just wanted to say, actually, to add about the elephant encounters. When I was traveling in East Africa, we did get a sort of false charge by a big elephant. We got too close, I think, to the little ones, and it was unbelievably terrifying. On the other hand, I will say I was traveling in Asia and wandered off to a sort of non-touristy little elephant camp. And, you know, there was a mother and a baby basically just standing out in the open, and I was feeding the baby bananas. And it was like the most incredible experience I've ever had. With, you know, these really calm elephants and I mean, they were gigantic, but just really calm, and being able to just feed this little baby while the mother just sort of stood by and watched. It was incredible.
I'll butt in here. This is Chris. I heard a story recently on Facebook about a herd of elephants that went to the home of a man who had
Anthony
just died.
Lawrence.
What?
Anthony Lawrence.
Yeah, and they, oh, can you tell the story then? I just got it from Facebook.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Chris. I don't know too much about that story, only that he had rescued quite a number of elephants in his time in South Africa. There's a whole book, I think it might be called The Elephant Whisperer, about him. And the story is a year after he died, that in a kind of funeral procession almost, that elephants walked up to his home in big numbers. Is that what you were going to say?
Yeah, I think so. And I think they stayed there for like for quite a while, just silently stood there.
It's just amazing. I mean, I fully believe that story, every word of it. Elephants are so wildly intelligent. We don't even fully comprehend. We're not smart enough to know how smart they are.
Thank you.
Well, I'm more familiar with whales, and the same story is true of whales.
Definitely.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for being here and for staying to entertain all of our questions. I am fully aware that we have more questions in the chat, and I will send them to our speaker on an email right now so we can be conscious about her time as well. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. I am so happy that you're here, you're staying and enjoying yourselves. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.